supply chain. And we have some of my colleagues, ex-colleagues, to present. Jim Kelly is the CEO of OptTek Systems. And then we have, fortunate to have most of the executive team. Their vice presidents, Marco Bitter, Kelly Wenzel, and Dave Davino. And so I think two of them are going to present, and the other two have come to answer any questions you might have. So, and I think we're going to have Jim give you an introduction and talk about workforce planning, and then we might take a couple-minute break for Marco to be able to set up the computer to give you a presentation on the demonstration of the software that it rides on. Okay, and it's open for questions. I hope that you are thinking about the types of questions that you can ask and have a very rich experience tonight. Okay, so Jim.
Thank you. Thank you, Jay. Well, happy to be here tonight. I was a professor over at CU Boulder for about a dozen years in the 90s and early 2000s, and I did my share of PowerPoints. I'm not going to use PowerPoint tonight. I know you're all disappointed, but I'm going to try to do things on the board, and I'm going to give more of the theoretical or the backside, sort of the theory behind workforce planning, and then, like as Jay said, Marco is going to come up and show some of the software we've created to represent some of this theory. And
I do have some PowerPoint slides.
you have some PowerPoint slides? Yeah, well, they're all happy now, right? You're all happy.
They've had their share of both.
Yeah. And what I'm going to talk about, and what we're going to talk about today, is workforce planning. And you may think of this as being more on the HR side of the business. However, the reality is I know you're all getting MBAs with an emphasis in operations management, correct? Or something like that, right? Yeah, something like
It's a required course.
Oh, required course, that's why you're well, you know, workforce planning is trying to figure out how to have the right people available to actually staff your operations. So it's really an important part, and the way we think about it is very much the way you may have talked about inventory, if you've talked about inventory at all. We think about it in terms of people, and that's our perspective tonight. You know, I'm not going to talk about scheduling. Scheduling is like Joe works from 8 to midnight, and then it's replaced with Jane, who works from midnight to 4 a.m. I'm not going to talk about those kinds of applications. That's what I would call tactical kinds of planning. You know, short term, at most a few weeks, maybe a month out. The kind of planning I'm talking about is months out, maybe even years out, in terms of staffing and organization. And the kind of organizations I'm talking about are big. Not 100 people, not 200 people, probably on the order of 2,000, 3,000 and up. Our largest customer right now has 330,000 people all over the world, of course. So, you know, we're talking about Fortune 500 companies primarily that take this really seriously. Because when it's really small, like 100 people, it really, you may have heard of a term called succession planning. That's kind of like looking at people and who's going to leave and who's going to take their spot. It evolves more into that kind of analysis. But when you have thousands and thousands of people, it's not that kind of process. There might still be that kind of process for the CEO, the CFO, et cetera, but for the vast majority, they use a different kind of analysis to make sure they have the right people. And I'm not going to talk about tracking software. HR is full of tracking software, HRIS systems that track vacation, pay, benefits, all those kinds of things. I'm not focusing on those as well. So really, my goal is to talk about how to have the right talent available when you need it. And that's really, that's all it is. Really, it's that simple. And you know, the time scale here, because we're talking about months or years, we're not talking about real time, like the change between today and tomorrow. It's not really relevant. We're probably measuring time in about a monthly basis. You know, from 1 month to the next over maybe a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years out. And you know, give you an example of this. We worked with several professional engineering companies, large ones, and you know, they may look at and say, you know, maybe they have 132 junior engineers, junior civil engineers, and they have to predict how many people they're going to need in 2020. So they have 132 now. They're going to have some need in 2020. How do they get there from today to there? How do they grow that work, that skill set, that group of that cohort of engineers, so they have enough people in place to meet their needs? You know, in this case, what's that? 4 years from now, right? Sounds like a long ways away, but it's not that far, is it? Only 4 years. So you know, they're gonna be predicting what they're going to need. They're gonna have to worry about people they're going to lose because people are going to leave. They're going to have to worry about people being promoted and changing jobs, all kinds of things we're going to talk about tonight. But I'm talking about workforce planning on a very granular level. Anybody can say, CH2M Hill, one of these engineering companies, is going to grow 5% in the number of people. That's kind of not very, that's interesting, but it's not very actionable. What you want to know is, how's the civil engineering group going to grow? How's the electrical engineering group going to do? The water people, how are they going to grow? We want to have a very, very granular planning process, not the high level. That's the easy thing, but it's not really usable. We're really into actionable information, things you can do something with, and I hope you'll get a sense about what we're talking about. So, as Jay says, I'm going to run back and forth on these boards. So, really, you know, it all comes down to getting to the point when the talent you have, these are really small boards, is equal to the talent you need. And boy, if we have that, then everything is just fine. Now, what people, you could use this terminology, but I'm going to use a little bit different terminology. I'm going to say the talent you have is your supply. And that's going to use that terminology tonight. And the talent you need is the demand. So obviously, when supply equals demand, things are great. So when these two are equal, you know, we're in a pretty good spot. We have exactly what we need. We're probably minimizing our costs. We can accomplish our mission and our business objectives. But what happens when supply is less than demand? Who's happy when that happens? What do you think? In a business, in a large organization, when supply is less than what you need, what do you think generally thinks that's just okay, and maybe even good?
The employees.
The employees? You think?
Like the workers, because they're ideally they'd be making more money, right?
Well, maybe they're getting pressed, maybe, but a lot of them are exempt and not getting any overtime or anything like that. They're just working harder, right?
Management, owners.
Management, and particularly the CFO loves that. That's why when we went through this last recession, you know, a few years ago, this situation, as we climbed out of the recession, occurred all over the nation, and productivity numbers were going through the roof. And it's because the supply was less than what we needed. Those guys were really stepping up and working really hard, producing more. Productivity was high, but you know, it's not really sustainable in the long run, right? This happens over and over again, by the way. Every time there's a recession, when demand often is, supply is greater than demand before the recession, it flip-flops. A lot of people get laid off, fired, let go, and then they start back up, and this situation occurs, and companies like to hang on to this because the stock prices rise. Remember at the beginning of the recession, when the recovery was occurring, stock prices were going up, even though people weren't finding jobs. And that's because productivity numbers raised those stock prices because they were making record profits at the time. So, you know, but what about the other way? How about when supply is greater than demand? Who's happy now in that situation? Now the employees may be a little bit happy, right? You like to be busy, but maybe not 110% busy, right?
Exactly.
So having a little bit of slack is nice, generally. And now the problem with that is it sustainable? Not until that CFO finds out this is going on, and she's going to make sure that this stops pretty quickly, and they're going to have reductions in hires, or maybe even let people go. So, from a financial point of view, it's probably not going to be sustainable. But there is one case when this is the typical situation. This isn't greatly larger than this, but it can be larger than that. Can you think of any situation where you'd want that to always be true?
Growth projection.
Exactly. Marco, you want to fill him in on that?
Exactly. Yeah, when you expect an increase in demand in the short run, you want to have a bench, right? You want to have some extra people that can perform those jobs. And so they actually call it a bench, like in sports, when you have some extra players that go in when somebody gets injured or something. You want to have people who can supply those skills and that labor when demand is going up in the short term. So managing your bench is an important part of workforce planning.
And if you talk about inventory control applied to people, it's really like safety stock in inventory. You may have talked about safety stock, always keeping a certain level of inventory in place because you don't know about the variation in demand. That's the same idea here. Exactly the same thing. So obviously we have to talk and understand about the supply side of the equation as well as the demand side. The demand side is predicting the future needs of your company, and the supply side is more about, we're going to talk about those people evolve in your organization, how they're recruited, trained, promoted, and move through the system and on the supply side. So let's talk about supply a little bit. What do you think, if you're talking about the supply of people in an organization, what's the very first thing you probably think about? The very first thing, probably, that many of you are going to be very interested in probably fairly soon. If not already, maybe you already have jobs, most of you.
Pay?
Pay, possibly, but even before that, from the organization's point of view.
The structure of the organization?
No, well, it could be, but what I'm trying to get at is just simply recruiting, right? Because recruiting is how you get people into your organization. It's about the only way, really. You have to hire people into the organization. Now, you said pay. Obviously, recruiting has some things that affect it. What are things that might affect recruiting? Well, cost or pay, one of them. There's sort of the cost of recruiting. You can actually spend a lot of money on recruiting people. If you use, talent organizations. Kelly, what's a typical thing range for using people, like a headhunter kind of?
Headhunter could be 20 to 30% of first year's annual income.
Yeah, so
it
just
could
the
be a
process
lot.
of hiring someone can be very high.
And that's just the recruiting piece. It's
Yeah.
not everything else.
Not the training and onboarding and all that.
Ramping
Just
up,
simply getting them to sign
advertisement.
the dotted line.
Yep.
There's sort of the cost of recruiting, and of course, related to that, your success is going to have something to do with the pay that you offer those people. How many you can attract to come. What else affects recruiting?
Competitors?
Competitors, and so in a more general sense, availability, right? Because just because you want to grow doesn't mean you can find the people that you need. And that's actually becoming more of a problem in sort of the STEM disciplines, science, technology, mathematics. It's harder and harder to find those kinds of people. In Boulder, which is where we're from, a few years ago, it took about 6 months to find a sort of a 2 to 3 year out software developer. Now it's up to about 18 months because of the lack of the supply in the marketplace. I mean, that's the average. Sometimes it's faster, sometimes it's longer, but it's all because of availability. So that becomes a big issue. And of course, certain parts of the country may have more availability than others, right? If you're in a major metropolitan area, you probably have more availability than you're out in the middle of Kansas somewhere. So what else could happen? What else could affect recruiting and how it plays into supply?
the type of talent that you're trying to recruit for?
That's right, the availability of the specific talent. And the thing we refer to in terms of how long it takes, timing. I mean, just because I need someone now, if I just decided I needed someone today, it may take me 6 months, even a year, to hire somebody. So obviously you have to anticipate that. You can't go looking for someone the day you need it. It may take months or even years, especially as you move up in the level of the position, it can take longer and longer. So those are all things that affect recruiting, and Marco will talk a little bit about those when we get into the software possibly. But that's people coming in. What about the other side of the equation? Yeah, attrition. People leaving. In general, there are two main kinds of attrition. There's the kind where the employee controls it. Voluntary. And involuntary is when, what?
You fire.
Yeah, involuntary attrition is when you're asked to leave. The exception would be we did some work for the Army. Sometimes, unfortunately, people were lost in the process, so they didn't actually get fired, they died. But voluntary and involuntary. And voluntary, what do you think? What are the kinds of things people are considering when they were talking about voluntary?
Pay, working conditions.
Pay, working conditions, what else?
Just not happy with the work environment.
Not happy with the work environment, what else?
I think specifically managers.
Management is a thing that comes up a lot. I love the company, but my manager stinks. And you hear it over and over again, right?
I hear it all the time.
You heard all the time. Yeah. I never hear that. It's amazing. I never heard that. What affects? What kinds of things do you think will? Those are the factors. If you had to specify things that you could look at an employee, what do you think you'd be looking at to decide how likely it is someone's going to leave?
How big was their last raise and when was it?
Yeah, there could be, and that's sort of a measure of performance, possibly, right? Because often raises are tied into performance.
Engagement levels, if they're engaged.
Engaged. Yeah, it's a tough thing to measure, that engagement. I know people are trying to figure out better and better ways to do it, but it's sort of a catch-all thing that, are they happy, essentially, right? In some sense. But engagement scores sometimes can measure that. How about just something simple as tenure? We see over and over again that junior employees right out of school, they're lucky if they're in a company for more than 2 years these days. Now, once you're there 4, 5, 6 years, you're much more likely to stay, right? But people hop around quite a bit in their first job in today's economy. So how long you're there can have a big impact on whether you're likely to be there next year. If you just started, I can say there's a 50% chance you won't be here in 2 years, in many cases. You'll probably be working across the street for the competitor. We'll train you, you move across the street, you'll get promoted and you'll come back in 5 years. And we'll raise your salary that way. Do you think, how about, we talk about roles, which are really jobs. The role you're in may have an impact on whether you stay. If you're, depending on the kind of work you do, can affect how long people stay. How about anything else?
I would say significant life events for some people, having a child or a second child.
Yeah, and I'm gonna just lump those all into demographics. Do you have a family? If you're a woman, did you just have a baby? There's some increased probability you won't come back in that situation, right? There's age, gender, education level, the kind of job. If you're working in an hourly job, you could probably get that hourly job with the unemployment rates now, 2.6% or something like that in Boulder. I think it's a little higher here in Denver, but pretty low anyway. I mean, if it's really easy if you're at an hourly job to move around right now and find other opportunities pretty easily. What else would affect attrition?
Well, I think the opportunities to grow intellectually and
Yes.
perhaps as a leader as well and as a professional. For a lot of my friends, that's why they don't stay with a company because there's no more room to grow.
We've been studying something that Marco might want to talk about in a company that's been looking at promotions and the impact on attrition, right?
Yeah, the recency and the number of promotions that you get. So you're right. The two main things that are mentioned in exit surveys or exit interviews and engagement surveys are the quality of the manager and the career development opportunities or lack thereof as reasons for leaving.
And we're not going to get into all the details, but we do a lot of data analysis to track people through their careers historically and seeing what the rates of promotions are and how they move up and who stays and who goes and those kinds of things. It's part of our modeling process.
What are good career paths?
Right now, one could say with the unemployment rate pretty low, that the economy is in pretty good shape, for at least some sectors, right? You have a really strong economy. Do you think that increases attrition or not? Probably does, right? If there's other opportunities out there, people are looking for people to grow, attrition goes up. When they, half a dozen years ago, attrition wasn't very high. Not voluntary attrition anyway. Involuntary, unfortunately, was, but not voluntary. So, the state of the economy has an impact on attrition. We talked about leadership. Businesses often have all kinds of programs. They understand that attrition is expensive. Why? Because when you lose someone, not only do you have to go back to the well and hire someone new, which costs, you have to bring those people in, you have a delay, because you didn't normally plan on those people leaving necessarily. They gave you 2 weeks notice or a month notice. It might take you 6 months to fill their spot. So you have a gap there. Also, you have the situation that when you can't fill those places, when you do get a person back in, you have to train them. They may not even add value to the organization till a year in their career. They have to be brought up to a certain level where they can actually produce more than we're paying them, for example. So there are all kinds of programs, mentoring programs, onboarding programs, programs that try to encourage retention. What about training and education also plays a role, of course. In getting, it's also that career advancement stuff, being able to learn more about different opportunities and obtain more education and move up in the organization. There's some really sort of unusual things that have an impact too. One is, how far away from work do you live? You can imagine that depends a lot on the kind of position you have. If you have a high-level position, maybe that isn't such a big deal. But if you're sort of at the bottom of the organization and you're traveling an hour and a half to go to work every day, and there's something closer by that's 30 minutes away, it's going to have a big impact, right, on whether you stay or not. Some of the unusual things like that can have an impact, is what I'm trying to say. We're always trying to think and talk with our clients about what do you think is affecting attrition. One of the things we just studied recently with one of our clients was what happened. It was a large software services company. You would know, I shouldn't probably say who they are, right? But you probably have all used them at some point on the web. They had one business group that they decided was doing a lot of work from home. Software developers were working from home. And their executive came in and she said, we're stopping this. You all will come into the office.
It wasn't Yahoo.
No.
I know you're all thinking it was, but.
Yeah.
I thought it was Yahoo.
Well, they did the same thing.
They did the same thing.
This is a thing that's going on a lot in a lot of places right now, this pulling back of working at home. Well, what do you think happened as soon as they did that? What?
They lost their developers.
They lost a lot of developers. The developers who joined and got used to that ability to work at home 2 or 3 days a week, right? A lot of those people left, so they had this precipitous drop. Of course, they replaced these people. They hired new ones, and they climbed back up. But once all the dust settled, the attrition rate was about the same as it was in the beginning. So, and maybe even just a little bit lower, believe it or not. Why do you think it might even be lower in the long run by having people come in and work all their hours at the office? I'm just making this up. I don't know if it's true or not, but what do you think?
I think there's value in relationships.
Yeah.
That's the nicest way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
What else?
Well, you're held accountable when other people are around you.
Yeah, it's hard to look for a job when you're in a cube environment and everyone can see everybody's computer, but it's a lot easier at home on the dining room table, isn't it? Probably, yeah. I don't know. We don't really know why, but it certainly didn't impact the organization in the long run. You might say we lost some good developers. Maybe that's the case, but it's hard to measure that. And so they felt like they made a good move, and I think a lot of companies are doing the same thing. Actually, it's kind of rolling back that idea of pushing everyone out.
The other thing we thought about, if you think about it, is anybody who came in after the change in policy wouldn't know what it was like before, and so they were perfectly happy to work in the new environment, and it didn't affect them anymore.
Lots of things that can, and I didn't mention retirement, but you can talk to Jay about that. Sorry. He retired a year ago from OptTek, that's why I mentioned that. But you know, retirement is something that...
Work at home.
Retirement really isn't, yeah, that's right. You just had the home part, that was the problem. Yeah. The retirement is really a little bit different than it used to be. It used to be everyone left when they were 65, right? That just isn't the case anymore. It's really just a special case of voluntary, people leaving voluntarily. And, but obviously it's driven a lot by age. You know, once you hit that 65 mark and Medicare then kicks in, there's a lot of reasons why people can leave the organization and voluntarily leave. But no one's really pushed out, at least not in most businesses. I mean, unless you're an airline pilot or something like that, you're forced to retire. I guess it's 60, right? If you're in a commercial airline pilot, I think, as an example. What else affects attrition? No, that's enough on attrition. What other things happen within the organization? Well, we talked a little bit about these promotions, moving up in the organization, transfers. You might be surprised that a lot of organizations don't. Some organizations encourage transfers from one group to another, and others don't. They discourage it and almost make it impossible. You can imagine when you're talking about supply and demand and trying to balance them, allowing people to transfer from one place to another easily can alleviate the problems when there's an imbalance. And we have to model that. Promotions, of course, you don't just come in as a junior engineer and stay as a junior engineer there all your life. You gain skills, you raise up, you're promoted from level to level if you stay. And so we have to consider those kinds of things as well. So really what's coming in? You have recruitment coming into the organization, you have attrition leaving, and within the organization, you have promotions, transfers, education, training, all those things going on inside. So that's essentially what's going on in these workforce planning world, or this workforce planning system on the supply side. So, let's talk about demand. Because if you understand supply, the next thing then is to look at how it matches up with what you really need. That's what you're going to have, supply. How does it match up with what you need? Remember, we want to predict demand at a very granular level. We want to know how many junior civil engineers we're going to need in Florida in next year and the following year, etc. Very, very specific. Not just we want to grow by 5%. So if you want to know that, how can you predict that? How how would you predict something like that?
You can model it.
Yeah, model it. How would you model it?
You can forecast what kind of projects you're working on based on, I guess, your past work might be some predictor of future work. You can forecast offices you want to open, projects you're marketing towards, and that can shape the people you hire, promote within.
We should hire him. What do you think? Okay. That's exactly what we do. We take business plans that are produced by the marketing group or in the financial groups. These are plans for the growth of the business, right? In terms of projects and things like that you just spoke of. And then translate those into specific needs at the very granular and role level. That's exactly what we do. And I'll give you an example. For example, maybe, you know, number. So. We might get something, we might have a function that looks something like this. A plus B times, So we might have this metric that has how much revenue we're predicting for a certain business line in the next few months, next year. This is the business plan, essentially. And we want to then create a function that looks, this is a very simple one, and much more complicated than this, but the point is that you have some function that relates your business plan to your people plan. And how would you find A and B? How would you go about finding A and B, those coefficients?
From the previous history?
Yeah, you just
similar
look at the
projects?
history, you look at the number of Java programmers you've had in the past, you look at the revenue you've had in the past, you fit that to this nice simple regression equation, and boom, you have A and B. Now, it's not usually that simple. First of all, you don't know what these factors are necessarily over here, the variables you want in your regression. That's a simple one. Revenue usually plays a role, but there could be the kinds of projects you're working on, the kinds of, what other things are considered?
The software products that you're planning to roll out in the next couple months or years. If we're talking about healthcare, it might be the growth in the aging population could be a metric for that. Production volume, sales volume, forecasts. All of those are metrics that we've used with some of our clients.
Yeah, the idea basically is to take the business plans, the financial plans, the marketing plans, and relate them back to the people. That's really what it comes down to. And whether it's this function or a much more complicated one, it's the same idea. The trick, of course, is to figure out which of those metrics to use. And it could be different for different roles. You know, one metric, a metric like this might be good for Java programmers, but not necessarily good for accountants or something like that. What else? How else could you go about doing this? That's the good way to do it. That's the way we do it. But what else? What other approaches could you use? What do you think what other approaches would someone use if they weren't going to use sort of this historical data and then fitting into a model and predicting forward? What else?
You have like a standard, for instance, you have a team of number of members in it with the same amount of work. You're getting more work. We need like per hour, a developer.
Yeah, sometimes you can have standards. That's right, and it's sort of connected to this in some way. That's essentially setting up the standards, right? What else?
You could look at a company that's about the size that you think you want to be and how many people they have and kind of.
Could do benchmarking, yeah. Yeah, that's a possibility. How about what is actually used quite often is going down at the very low level management and asking them to make predictions going forward. How many people do you think you're going to need in the next year or two? And then roll that all up. You could imagine that might work. What do you think might happen in a situation like that, though? If you go down to the very lowest level of management and say, predict out the next 2 years what you're going to need in terms of these various skills, what do you think might happen?
You'll probably end up with more than what you need.
Why would that be?
Because managers at the bottom level, they like to, it's gonna be like a kind of a conflict between the individual team's needs and the financial side of the equation. So I would say often you would end up with.
They tend to be bloated, for sure. They tend to be heavy. So you know that becomes a real problem. What do I do with my notes now? Must have left it so far. Right. All right, all back there. Okay. Yeah, you know, the estimates that come out of that system are often heavy. And the other thing is, the lowest level management may not have the business vision that the higher level, you know, they don't know you're going into a new line of business necessarily, or they don't know that there's a competitor on the horizon that's probably going to hurt us. They may not see that. They may or they may not, but the point is they may not have the visibility that maybe at a higher level you might see. Because when people are making financial projections, they're going to consider all those things, for example, whereas at the lowest level, maybe not so much. And the other way is just saying, we're going to grow by 5%. Unfortunately, there are a lot of companies that still do that and say, across the board, every role is going to grow by 5%. What do you think about that?
Not the best policy.
No, probably not. You know, if you are, what's US West now, or Quest? It's CenturyLink. If you're CenturyLink, you think the hard line installation people are growing at 5%? The company might be still growing, I don't know. But there are certain lines of business that are going down, right? And certain lines of business that are going up. So the thought that all are growing at the same rate is just ridiculous. And there's technology issues that can come into play, making people much more productive, right? In terms of their leverage. Maybe 10 years ago you need so many HR staff per employees. Maybe for every 1,000 employees you needed so many HR people. That's probably, that ratio is changing because of changing needs and technology. So those are some of the things that you can consider when you're talking about the demand. So we have to predict the demand, and then we compare it to the prediction of the supply. So what happens when these don't match? When one of these two situations occurs? Okay, so and the difference between them, we call it the gap. Okay, this is the gap. And you know, quite often, you know, when supply is less than demand, what do you think what do you think we can do to try to remedy that when we have this situation? Things we've talked about so far, what could we do to help close that difference?
Recruiting?
Well, recruiting, that's one possibility. Get more people in. What else?
Educating your employees.
Yeah, because the gaps might be at higher level positions, and you may have to train them up to get to that point, right? What else? Technology, yeah, adding more technology might be able to increase their productivity, and that might help. What else? Maybe hanging on to people longer, retaining them, trying to work on retention. If you're trying to retain people, what would you be? Some of the things we've already talked about. What are they? Education was one, right? Programs to hold on to people, mentoring, onboarding programs.
Well, it seems if the two biggest reasons people leave are the managers' lack of career opportunities, then those would be your lowest hanging fruit.
Yeah. One of the problems about the management, yeah, and have we done studies on anything to do with the training, improvement of management?
We've done studies on span of control, and when managers have too many people to supervise, that's usually detrimental to the retention of their employees. So not necessarily training, just span of control studies.
Benefits, improving benefits can allow you to hold on to people. How about culture? You probably read a little bit about, anybody here work for Amazon? The culture there isn't exactly the most friendly place in the world. It's a very cutthroat culture that, you know, that breeds a lot of backstabbing and kinds of things. You get to evaluate your peers for raises and things like that. It's caused a lot of issues in terms of of a toxic type culture, as opposed to some other more friendly places to work like OptTek, right?
100% retention.
Yeah.
Other than retiring.
Of course, you could hire more people, like was mentioned earlier. More resources into hiring, more channels into hiring, and you may allow for transfers, right? Remember I told you that some companies actually lock people into silos. If you let them move around, if they have the right skill set, then you might be able to alleviate local supply and demand gaps.
And that has to do with career development opportunities too, because sometimes you need to transfer in order to move up, and if you recognize as an employee with potential, sometimes they can create programs for that.
What do you do when this is a situation? When we have more supply than we need?
Offshore, maybe, and hire a company to do it for you.
Well, this means we have more people than we need. More people than actually we need.
But can you do that? Can you, see if you're offshoring, paying people less to do the same work?
Oh, you're saying get rid of a lot of people and offshore it all. Okay. Oh, okay. Man, you're tough.
I think depending on.
I'm glad I don't work for you.
Depending on the foreseeable future, right, the business and the revenues, there are two options. Either, keep the employees, depending on if there are a lot of business and projects coming down the pipe, because the company is already invested in these employees. They're training, they know the
Right.
work and the environment, they'll be there for a while. Or do what most businesses do and cut them.
Yeah, ideally you'd look forward and say, hey, is there a place for these people in the near future, or whatever that means? Whether it might mean 3 months, 6 months. It probably doesn't mean 5 years. But if you can look forward to your demand and then say, okay, I've invested a lot of time and money into these people. I don't want to lose them now, so we'll figure out for something to do in the meantime. But that's one possibility. Certainly you would reduce hiring, right? If you have at least at certain roles. You may still be hiring at one role, but not at another. And so you may adjust your hiring practices. What else could you do? Well, you could just let them go, right? Like you said, you could just let them go. There are some organizations that, and you might be surprised about this, there is at least one organization we've worked with that can actually increase voluntary attrition. How do you think? That means making people want to leave. And we worked with one organization that did that, the U.S. Army.
Purposeful.
The U.S. Army. The Army, after the build-up to deal with Afghanistan and Iraq, they had about an extra 40,000 Army soldiers, right, enlisted. And they had to, these people were in the Army, re-enlisting over and over again, and they had to get them out. So guess how they did it? They didn't want to say you can't re-enlist, because that was not very politically savvy. That would just make it disaster. Someone has done 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan and say you can't re-enlist. That wouldn't go over so well. What do you think? How do you think they did it? You probably won't know, because you probably don't know about that world. But what they did was, there was a period in time when a soldier's time window to enlist occurs, re-enlist, and they have maybe 6 months of time to decide to re-enlist for another 2-4 years, right? What they did was they just shrunk the window. They made it really tight. A lot of these people weren't on top of things, and so they didn't re-enlist in time, and they weren't allowed to re-enlist, and they had to leave. And that was one way that they drove people out of the Army without forcing them out, so to speak, by increasing attrition.
I also think more supply than demand is why we have like the Amazon situation, because they don't care. They can have that kind of work environment to maximize productivity. They even say in there that they know that they're going to lose a lot of people. They don't care because they have 10 times the people wanting to come in and work for Amazon anyway. So you can actually maximize productivity, get them to burn out quickly, and then replace them with somebody else.
that's, you know, most companies are looking at attrition as being very costly, but there are some examples where that's not the case. You're right.
You can also retrain people.
Right.
So if you have misalignments, you can help people, tell people where the high demand skills are and give them a chance to learn those skills so that they can transfer from surplus areas to maybe deficit areas to fill gaps.
What do you think the hardest part of doing all this is, from an analytics point of view?
Getting the data?
Yay! Yeah, we get so much data, and it's such poor quality that we spend about, what do you think, 70% of our time, at least 70 to 80% of our time dealing with data and the poor quality of it, fixing it. You might say, well, what kinds of things are you talking about? I mean, all kinds of just normally bad things, recoding of data where it's coded one way one month, another way the next month, but also things like businesses are always going through reorganizations, and if you're tracking people in time, in history, and all of a sudden they were in one group and now they're over there and they have a different title and everything, you have to track that and have to track the people back in time. We're constantly worrying about those things because we're looking at history to predict the future. So we have to have an accurate understanding of where people move through their careers. Or maybe there were 300 jobs, titles, and they decided that was too many, now they have 150. So we have to figure out what the mapping was between the past and the current and the future. What are some of the other things that come up in the data?
You hit the big ones.
Yeah. But
I mean, other than having gender as male, female 1 month and M and F the next month, and you know, if you're trying to automate your data load, that can cause some problems because they're different values and all kinds of
demand planning. We're looking at history, and there's this big jump in the number of people, but the output from the organization didn't go up. And we said, what? That doesn't look good. And you find out they acquired someone. They acquired a large number of people, and they didn't tell us. So all of a sudden, it looks like they hired a whole bunch of people, and they're not producing any more goods and services. In other words, their productivity went way down, but we didn't understand that they actually acquired a company. Because we're talking about big companies here, hundreds of thousands of employees. They're acquiring people all the time and spinning off people sometimes. So data is the big problem. The fun part is the computer, the modeling, you said model it. That's the fun part. We use it. Marco will talk about that in a second. We use an agent-based simulation model for doing a lot of our modeling, in addition to some kind of nifty regression analysis for demand planning. And then the whole point of this is to create actionable data, actionable information that allow people to do things that can improve, reduce those gaps, essentially, in most cases, or at least understand what's going on in their organization better. Kelly was just talking to me today. We focus a lot on, we're trying to focus more on ROI of these kinds of things. By retaining people more, can you ultimately reduce the cost of your workforce, for example, as opposed to Amazon, who maybe just kind of runs through them really quickly. We've seen some organizations, particularly engineering companies, where the young employees are never becoming break even in terms of their contribution. The hours they're billing never gets achieved, never exceeds their salary even before they leave. And they're gone in with 1 or 2 years. So they're like a loss the whole time they're there, and that's the average case always. It's like a constant loss, as an example. So obviously if you can retain those people from 2 to 3 years, for example, it would make a huge difference. So that's sort of the background behind what we're going to show you. Any other questions for me, or the hard ones for Dave?
I have a question. Well, the supply is greater than demand. Are there any examples of companies just trying to drive demand up, not focusing on the supply as much?
I think that most consulting services firms do that. They realize maybe they lose a project. They're constantly selling. They're constantly out looking for projects to replace, because they realize that if a person is on the bench for too long, they're going to leave. And so if it's a valued employee, then they better find that person a spot as soon as possible so that they remain engaged. So I think project-based companies are constantly looking for replacement projects or even growth projects.
And marketing and sales, that's our whole goal, is to, to increase demand, of course, for products and services, right? And we're starting with their projections. That's where we start with. We start with their projections of the future to decide, and then we translate that into people needs. So actually, we're using their projections of where they're going with that.
The flip side of that was we saw a case with one of our clients where high performers were leaving at a much higher rate than average or low performers. And so why do you think that might be?
Lack of accountability for the low performance jobs?
Maybe. This was more related to your question.
Yeah, they just weren't on projects for them.
Yeah, they were losing business. They were losing projects and they weren't replacing them. And so high-performing people probably have more opportunities to go look for a job elsewhere. And so they were finding other jobs quicker than low performers who wanted to hold on to their jobs. And so it was a double whammy for the company. Not only were they losing business, they were retaining the employees they didn't want to retain.
It's kind of a spiral down. Well, what we're going to do now is take a few, you have something to say, Jay?
With what you said about data, are you seeing any improvement in those data based on more analytics becoming more popular in companies, more emphasis on software systems like Workdays and SAP, where they're collecting more of that data? Is the field seeing data improvements?
There's definitely, I think, better products out there like Workday that are incorporating more of the data, because what we saw in the past was a disconnect between talent acquisition or recruiting systems and then HR information systems. They couldn't track the candidate through the recruiting process and then once they became employees, and it's really important for us to do so. So we had to do all kinds of mappings and things to map the candidate through their hiring and then their career as an employee. With new types of systems like Workday, you can now track them through the whole life cycle. That's an improvement. But reorgs are not going to stop happening because they have a better system. And, there might be better data validation systems out there where, another improvement is that in older systems, there was a lot of more opportunities for the people entering the information to just enter some free form value for a field. And now there's a lot more data validation that, they have to conform to a set of values that they can use. For example, if somebody's being hired, then they can say, how did they find out about the job? Through a job board or through the website or through a recruiter. There's limited options. Obviously, there's always that other that 80% of people fall under still. But before, people would really enter free-form responses, and so it was a lot harder to code those responses than it is now. So it is getting better, but we're still spending that amount of time on data cleansing and harmonizing and standardizing.
I mean, to be fair to these companies, the systems that they have in place weren't meant to do what we're doing with them. The kind of data we're getting out, they weren't created to create this kind of data for us. We're using them to get the data out, but they were created for lots of other different internal use.
It was transactional.
Transactional type use. And we're trying to get other information they just weren't really designed to provide. And that's part of our problem.
The other thing is these new systems are new. And if we want 5 years of data, we have to map the new system to the old system, and that takes time too. Maybe in 3 years, 4 years, they'll have had one system in place for the full horizon of data that we need, and then things will be easier. The other thing is we've automated a lot of, our data modeling capabilities have improved because every case has been a challenge. And so we're getting more efficient at it as well.
Well, I mean, in this class, we've looked at a number of methods for improving the performance of the operations of the company. We've looked at Six Sigma and lean management. The last couple of times we've particularly spent our efforts looking at theory of constraints and what that can do to improve the operations of a company. Well, we've talked about this, where in most operations, they'll talk about the assets that they have, the technology that they have, and how important it is to use that properly and use it effectively. Well, we also know that in most companies, the workforce is the largest expense that that company has by a long shot, right? Over 50–60% of the expenses, the labor costs. Well, what about that within, looking at your operations? Is that something that should be improved? It should be treated as a real asset. You're looking at the ability to plan better. You're looking at the ability to make that workforce more effective, more efficient. You're looking at trying to lengthen the tenure of that workforce, because again, it's your biggest expense. And these are the kinds of things that one can do with the proper modeling of that workforce, and then with that modeling, be able to examine the decisions that you make prior to actually making them. And that's even more important when your workforce makes up the largest expense that you have, and therefore understanding the decisions that you're making, getting a better, let's say, feedback on the impacts of those decisions is critical to your operations. And this presentation that we just heard is an introduction to this. Believe it or not, one of the most advanced ways of looking at your workforce. And so that's why I wanted to introduce this to you as an operations management class, so that you'll have an understanding and an appreciation of what you can do with the proper technology for a workforce. A couple questions. For those of you that have voluntarily left jobs, give me some reasons why you left. Not involuntary, but voluntary.
Start my MBA.
Okay, so more opportunities, right? Who else?
No room for growth.
Pardon?
No room for growth. That's just.
You had that?
Yeah.
So that corroborated what was said here with regard to opportunities, right? There's a reason.
Work-life balance, or lack thereof, work-life balance, or lack thereof at some jobs.
So the lack thereof is why you left.
Yeah.
Was that gender related or just overall?
I don't know if it's generally just overall. I mean, I just worked way too much. I mean, yes, I did have like a kid too, so you could say that was gender related, but overall it was just too many hours for anyone. A mother or a person.
The reason I asked about the gender relation is my daughter did that. She's an attorney, and she was working for a large company, and she had a couple of babies, and it was just too many hours for the proper balance in terms of being a mother.
But it does make you rethink your priorities, for sure. But I feel like it's a point that you probably get to either way, right? It would just maybe take longer.
Might it make a difference if they let you work from home a bit?
Probably not, because I wouldn't have been able to. I mean, I was doing, accounting, so like I had to be on the phone with people and converse, and it's just too hard. I feel like to do accounting from home, because you need the papers, and I don't know, I need to like write it out, and
It's different making cheese, huh?
Yeah. Well, I don't actually make the cheese. I just count the cheese.
It's the Frito. Anybody else?
For to get a better pay promotion, nothing like that.
A lot
That's why I wanna hear was it corroborating some of the things that were said in some of these exit surveys? So we've had that, right? You think that, again, companies where they say the most valuable resources are their people would do more to change that, but then as you were saying before, with Amazon, you have companies like that we can always find new ones. We really don't care.
I think on the like management thing, sometimes firing a manager can be such an indictment of an organization who's promoted them multiple times for years, and to kind of admit we got it wrong is a really hard thing to do for a lot of organizations. And that's what you're doing when you fire a manager.
But might it be better to minimize your losses?
I think so, absolutely. I think I've been in organizations where a lot of people got fired and morale went up and up and up.
And I think to David's point too, ironically, it costs them way more money because they're keeping somebody that they're paying a lot of money because they don't want to fire them because they're making a lot of money, but they're losing a lot of people underneath, which is what happened to my old employer too, is that they kept a manager who kept having turnover because the team didn't want to work for that manager, and they didn't want to fire the manager because they didn't want to keep him with the company for a long time. So.
Bad example of loyalty. Anybody else? Okay. Any other questions?
Take a couple-minute break while Marco sets up for the presentation, right? Demo. And he has some PowerPoint slides, so.
And for all of you MSs in analytics, this is a good example of analytics technology. A lot more sophisticated than